Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about the positional matchups between the Chiefs and the 49ers. After a final tally, including special teams and coaches, the Chiefs were better in 6 out of the 10 positions that we went over. So, by that metric, at least it is favor of the Chiefs, but that's just my opinion there. Moving on to another NFL story and talking about the number one overall draft pick from this past season, Bryce Young. And I think that there's a very interesting way that we go about really evaluating all young quarterbacks. And it's a lot of the time, I think, toxic and messy, but it's also very inconsistent, in my opinion. So, Bryce Young, if you don't know, he coming from Alabama, former Heisman winner. The Carolina Panthers traded up to the number one pick, including trading their first round pick from this year, which now is the number one overall pick. So they gave up a whole lot to go up and get Bryce Young. Coming into last season, everybody was aware that the Panthers situation as a whole was far than less than ideal. They really didn't have any playmakers. They went and they signed a couple, solid guys that have been on solid teams. Miles Sanders, they signed Hayden Hurst, Adam Thielen, and old Adam Thielen at that. But they really didn't have all too many weapons, especially considering the fact that another part of that trade was giving up their number one receiver, DJ Moore, to go up and get Bryce Young. So I think all in all, it was never going to be an easy year for Bryce Young here in Carolina. And that was very much displayed by the results of the season, ending up with the number one overall draft position again, other than the fact that they don't actually have that pick. It was a very rough year. They finished 2-15, and it never really looked good. And that is a little bit of my issue here. So, as a whole, I don't like to try and write off young guys, especially at the quarterback position, which is obviously such a difficult position and one of the most heavily scrutinized positions. So, I don't really like bringing, the negativity necessarily to those arguments. Now, that being said, I feel like there's some level of apologies and forgiveness that has been given out to Bryce Young that we don't do for other quarterbacks, and it's not alone. I guess part of where my perspective from this comes is being a Patriots fan. Mac Jones, let's get ahead of it, he was never going to be a superstar quarterback, but he wasn't in the trajectory to be a bad quarterback, nowhere near as bad as he was this season. He was a Pro Bowler, granted an alternate. Granted, the Pro Bowl doesn't really mean anything, but he had a good year in his rookie season. I feel like maybe it's an easy comparison here. I feel like he's very similar to Brock Purdy in a lot of ways. He doesn't necessarily have the anticipation, at least as of this year. Obviously, it becomes a little foggy because of, Mac Jones's last good season was 3 years ago now at this point. Doesn't really have the anticipation, doesn't really have the mobility, maybe can't throw under pressure quite as well, especially this season. But I don't think that was always the case. The Patriots literally broke him over time. Mentally, he was a wreck by the end of this Patriots tenure. Yes, technically he's still under contract. I can't imagine that he's going to be back with the Patriots next year. But they had no weapons for him. They had no offensive line for him. And the coaching situation was just a disaster over the years, the way that he had 3 different offensive coordinators in 3 different years with the Patriots, including, of course, Matt Patricia, who is sort of the touch of death, almost a sense, as far as development and if your team has actual expectations on that side of the ball. So, I don't want to talk too much on Mac Jones here specifically, but everybody talks about how it's just Mac Jones, and he was never the level of prospect as Bryce Young. Justin Fields is another guy where everybody on national media now that the Bears are a conversation talks about the fact that the Bears did absolutely nothing to help Justin Fields, that nobody could have ever succeeded under those circumstances. But they addressed their offensive line. It still wasn't great, but it was better than it was a couple years ago when it was Nick Foles starting the offense. And they went out and they got a number one wide receiver in DJ Moore and a number one tight end in Cole Kmet. Those were solid options that they had. David Montgomery was a good running back for them at some time, but there's nothing that ever could have happened as far as a quarterback prospect walking into Chicago and succeeding there. That's sort of the narrative that's spinning right now. I don't think that that's really the case. I think that, it's just strange how we pick and choose which quarterback prospects we sort of defend and which guys it's pure skill and which guys it is the environment. So this is a little bit of a ramble right now, but getting into this Bryce Young conversation, it sort of piqued my interest because on ESPN, they made a redraft of the 2023 NFL draft. And this was done with a collection of different reporters. They're NFL Network reporters. And it was essentially a draft between all of them. There were no trades allowed. And this wasn't, one guy sitting down and putting different guys in different places. This is reporters of the team going back in retrospect and making these picks. Bryce Young in this situation fell from number 1 outside of the top 10 to number 11. And a lot of people online were pissed about it, talking about the disrespect to Bryce Young and just how unfair it was that the Panthers did to him. And I still am openly admitting this was not Bryce Young's fault. The season went this way. I just also feel like we're sort of waiting around this season to ever see some sort of a flash, and I just don't think that it came. It's easy to look back at the Texans, where I'm not directly comparing them, but we all love Nico Collins now. We all love Tank Dell. Tank Dell was a rookie. Nico Collins was with the Texans for a couple of years, but was entirely ineffective. Their run game, last year I guess more or less it was the same from last year to this year. This year, it was just more Singletary than Dameon Pierce. But, it's not that CJ Stroud was in a bad situation at all. But if CJ Stroud wasn't as good as he was, we wouldn't be looking at some of these pieces around him quite as positively as we currently are. The Panthers are a mess. Their owner is very dislikable for a lot of people, throwing drinks onto fans during the games. David Tepper, and he's taking a step back. We'll sort of see. And all of this to be said, I'm definitely not writing out Bryce Young yet, but I just find it very interesting the way that it's all excuses for him, despite the fact that the best game that was played by a quarterback last season for the Carolina Panthers was Andy Dalton early in the season against the Seahawks. We just never even really got a flash of that positive Bryce Young. They were pretty unwatchable for a lot of the year. The closest they came was when they pushed the Packers a little bit down the stretch of the season. I know that the Packers defense sort of reared its head a little bit in their playoff games, but this was a Packers defense that was heavily scrutinized all season because of Joe Barry. Packers fans were calling for the firing of Joe Barry. And so maybe there was a little bit of momentum there in that individual moment, but really for the most part, I just don't think that there were, what was the memorable Bryce Young moment from this year? I just don't really think there was one. And I'm definitely not writing him out. They are going to need to surround him with more talent, but I just feel like the national perception from a lot of Now, casual is maybe not the right word, but the typical NFL fan is that Bryce Young deserves zero of the blame for how bad last year was. And, I just don't think that should fully be the case. In this redraft, you had CJ Stroud going number 1 overall. I mean, do they win many more games? No, but I kind of feel like CJ Stroud could have had the potential to pull out at least a couple more of those games than they did. Number 2 pick in this redraft was Anthony Richardson, which is a little questionable. Anthony Richardson, he really flashed when he came into the season the way that he was playing. He obviously dealt with injuries even from his second game, and then was ultimately out for the year after taking a hard hit a couple games later. So, this was somebody that was definitely climbing up draft boards a lot going into the year. We didn't get to see a lot of him this season, but I don't necessarily disagree or have any problems with him being taken above Bryce Young in this redraft. A lot of people are just mad about the fact that he fell out of the top 10. And, a lot of NFL guys really liked Bryce Young as a prospect coming into this season. So, is it fair for him to drop down 10 spots? I don't know necessarily. I'm not an expert on college football. So, obviously, what all of these guys saw pre-draft to the point where he wasn't... The Panthers weren't given any scrutiny for the decision to draft Bryce Young at the time. And they're still not getting any, which means that Bryce Young should be, that he is still a pretty good prospect for the Panthers going forward. What they do to surround him with talent is definitely still up in the air. And I guess maybe it's just the way that I have a problem with the way that everybody as a whole sort of evaluates this position. Like, I feel like we just pick and choose so much when it is a quarterback's fault based off of whether or not we like them or not. Because how much, and again, not perfect scenarios. I know that Zach Wilson had a number 1 receiver, at least, in Garrett Wilson, but how much better was Bryce Young's rookie season than anything Zach Wilson has ever put out there? Again, not a perfect comparison, but I feel like to some level, Bryce Young deserves some criticism. I'm not trying to be a jerk here or anything or wish ill will on any player. I just think that as a football society almost, we sort of need to come up with more defined expectations for these quarterbacks, because when it's Zach Wilson in a national market trying to lead the charge and take the team over the hump, another team that has not been very good for the majority of the past 10 plus years, he is immediately the problem. The offensive line has never been good for him there. He's had one good receiver, but that's about it. And he is being thrown off the cliff, essentially, as far as the way that NFL fans treat him versus Bryce Young, who, again, definitely was a better prospect than Zach Wilson coming into the year. But I think that he just has a lot to prove still. And I don't think that a lot of NFL fans sort of feel the same way as me. But we'll see with next season. I think that it also sort of becomes maybe a little bit harsher circumstances, for me at least, because the Panthers decided to give up as much as they did to go get Bryce Young. And this isn't trying to be an indictment on himself. It's maybe more of an organizational thing. It's not his fault that they did give up all these assets to go get him with the number 1 pick. But they're going to have a lot of work to do to sort of turn this thing around. And I just have a little bit of doubts whether or not Bryce Young is the one who's going to be able to overcome this. So that is all I have on Bryce Young and the Panthers for now. Again, not trying to spread negativity really, or anything. I guess I'm just more frustrated with the overall NFL discourse that comes with these young quarterbacks and the way that we evaluate the position. But we're going to be taking our second break. When we come back on the other side, we're going to be talking NFL and the Milwaukee Bucks after they drop another one last night. So stick with us.